The smell of biscuits reached the road before anything else did. That was what Caleb Marsh noticed first on that particular Sunday morning in October. Not the smoke from the chimney, not the lantern burning low in the kitchen window, not even the sound of a pot lid settling against its rim somewhere beyond the cabin's walls. It was the biscuits, warm and plain and entirely too many of them for a woman living alone. He had been riding the same stretch of road past the Holt property for 6 weeks running, past the fence post that leaned left at the corner, past the woodpile she kept neater than any man he'd ever known kept his, past the small kitchen garden gone mostly to seed for the season, except for the last of the kale standing stubborn at the far edge, which Caleb had decided some weeks ago was a fair description of the woman who'd planted it. He didn't stop. He never stopped. A man didn't stop at a widow's fence on a Sunday morning with nothing better to offer than the fact that he'd been riding past her property every week since he'd taken the Dunmore lease in August, and noticed, each time, that her woodpile was full, her fence was mended, and her biscuits smelled like something a person shouldn't have to eat alone. He wrote on, "If this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe to The Hidden Acre, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. There's something about a frontier love story that finds exactly the people who need it. Let's see who's here." Garnet Ridge, Colorado Territory, November 1881. The town was small enough that everyone knew Clara Holt's situation, which meant everyone had an opinion about it, which meant Clara had long since stopped listening to any of them. Her husband, Daniel, had been gone 14 months. Not gone the way people said it gently. Not passed, not lost, not taken too soon. Gone the hard way, the way the frontier took men without asking permission. A riding accident on the high trail in early September of the previous year, the coroner had said. The horse had come home by supper time. Daniel had not. She had buried him on a Thursday. By the following Monday she had gone back to her garden because the alternative was sitting in a house full of his absence, and she had decided, sitting at his grave with the mountains going purple at the edges and the first cold of autumn already threading through the pines, that she would not do that. She would not become a woman defined entirely by the space where a man used to be. What she had not anticipated was how much of the daily shape of her life had been built around another person's presence. Not dramatically. Not the way the Reverend's wife had hinted, suggesting that Clara must feel so lost without someone to care for. It was smaller than that and worse. It was setting 2 cups out of habit and only catching herself after the coffee was poured. It was starting a sentence at supper that had no one to finish hearing it. It was cooking on Sundays, when Daniel had always been home from his week's work by noon and hungry enough to make her feel like the biscuits were worth the effort. She still made the biscuits. That was the thing that surprised her most about grief. The way the habits of a shared life kept their shape even after the life itself had changed entirely. Every Sunday, without deciding to, she made 2 dozen biscuits, a pot of beans, whatever the garden or the smokehouse offered, and sat down to eat a portion of it alone. The rest, she wrapped and took to old Berta Scholl, who was 74 and too proud to ask for food, but always opened the door on Sunday afternoons, as if she'd been expecting someone. Clara understood, more than she would have said aloud, exactly what it meant to open a door like that. She was at the stove when she heard the horse slow on the road. She didn't look up. Men slowed their horses on the road past her property regularly enough that she had stopped tracking each one. She had a particular economy of attention she'd developed over 14 months. She noticed what required noticing and left the rest alone. The horse slowed, then stopped. She heard the leather creak of a man shifting in a saddle, the particular sound of someone not quite deciding something. Then the horse moved on. She looked up then, just in time to see the back of a gray roan disappearing around the bend. The rider sat straight in the saddle, not hurried, not slow. She thought she recognized the horse, the Dunmore lease maybe. She'd heard someone had taken it in late summer, some man from Kansas. Steady sort, the feed store owner had mentioned once without her asking. She went back to the biscuits. The following Sunday, same hour, same thing. The slow of hooves. The stop. The creak of a man thinking. The eventual moving on. She began to notice, not because she was watching for it, but because there is only so much a person can pretend not to notice when it happens 6 times in a row. On the 7th Sunday, she left the door open while she cooked. She told herself it was because the kitchen was warm with the stove going and the air outside had that particular October edge to it that made a closed space feel small. She told herself it had nothing to do with the fact that she had begun, quietly and without much examining the feeling, to look toward the road at a certain hour. She heard him slow. She heard him stop. She stirred the beans. Mrs. Holt. His voice was lower than she'd expected from the distance, and direct in the way of a man who'd made up his mind just ahead of speaking. She turned from the stove. He was at the fence, the gate end, not leaning on it, just standing beside it with his hat in his hand and the gray roan standing patient at his shoulder. He was somewhere in his early 30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something more settled than handsome, but more honest than most. "Mr. she started. "Marsh. Caleb Marsh. I've got the Dunmore lease up the north end." "I know who you are," Clara said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended. "I've been watching you ride past my fence for 2 months." Something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly. Closer to the look of a man caught doing something he'd already decided was probably foolish. "The biscuits reached the road," he said. "Thought you should know." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the stove. Then she looked at the table, which was set for one. "How many do you cook?" he asked. It was such a particular question that she almost didn't answer it. 2 dozen, she said. "Habit." He nodded, slow, as if 2 dozen biscuits told him something he'd been trying to work out for several weeks. "Maybe they did." "Who are you cooking for?" he said. The question was not unkind. It was not pointed. It was simply the most direct thing anyone had asked her in 14 months of people speaking carefully around the edges of her life. And it hit somewhere behind her sternum with a force that had nothing to do with the words themselves. She didn't answer right away. He didn't fill the silence, which she noted without quite meaning to. "My neighbor," she said finally. "Old Berta Scholl. I bring her the rest on Sunday afternoons." "That's a good thing to do," he said. "It's a practical thing," Clara corrected. "She won't ask for food and she needs it, and I make too much." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. She looked at him again. He had put his hat back on, which she interpreted as the action of a man who had said what he came to say and was preparing to leave now that he'd said it. She found, which surprised her, that she didn't particularly want him to leave. "Have you eaten?" she asked. The words came out the way words did sometimes, before the part of her brain that managed propriety and caution and the opinion of Garnet Ridge had a chance to review them. He went still in the way of a man who hadn't expected that. "No, ma'am," he said. "There's biscuits," she said, "and beans, and I have no idea why I'm saying this." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, something quieter than that. "I expect you're saying it because it's Sunday," he said, "and biscuits weren't made to be eaten alone." She stepped back from the doorway. He tied the roan to the fence post, the good one, not the one that leaned, and came up the path. They ate at the kitchen table with the door still open, and the October air moving through, and the mountains visible through the window, going from green to gold to something between the two that had no proper name. He ate without ceremony and without excessive compliment, and listened when she talked, and talked when she asked him something, which was less than she'd expected of a stranger at her table, and more than she'd had from any company in some time. She asked him about the Dunmore lease. He told her it needed work along the east fence line, and that he'd got a reasonable price on lumber at the mill, and that he had 6 cows currently, and plans for more in spring, if the winter was manageable. "Winters here aren't manageable," Clara said. "They're endured." "Fair enough," he said. "I've endured a few." "Where?" "Kansas, mostly. Before that, Iowa. I don't stay in one place long." He said it without apology but not with pride. Just the plain fact of it. "I'm trying to stay here." "Why here?" He looked at the mountains through the window for a moment. "The light," he said, which was an unusual answer for a rancher, and she filed it away without commenting on it. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from the Hidden Acre. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch all the way to the end are exactly the ones who understand what these stories are really about. He came back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. He never announced he was coming. He never asked if he could. He simply arrived at a certain hour with his hat in his hand and sometimes a thing he'd brought, a basket of late apples from the tree on the north end of his property, a jar of honey from the beekeeper 3 miles up the road, once a length of rope she'd mentioned needing when they'd talked about the kitchen garden gate. He never made a production of any of it. He set things on the fence post and went to the door and asked, plainly, if she'd eaten. She always had. She cooked twice as much as she had before. She didn't examine that too closely. The town noticed, of course. Garnet Ridge was not large enough for a widow to receive regular Sunday callers, without the fact becoming general knowledge within a fortnight. Mrs. Aldrich from the dry goods mentioned it first. Not directly, but in the way of a woman raising a topic so carefully oblique, it required another person to name it plainly, or let it pass unnamed. Clara let it pass. The Reverend's wife came by one Wednesday afternoon, with a crumb cake and a look of considered concern, and said that she hoped Clara was being careful, given that she didn't know very much about Mr. Marsh. I know what I know, Clara said, which was not nothing. She knew he showed up when he said he would. She knew he didn't make assumptions about what his presence meant. She knew he ate without waste, and washed his own cup before he left, and never once suggested, in word or in the particular way men sometimes suggested things without words, that a widow ought to be grateful for any attention she received. She knew he had lost someone too, though it had taken several Sundays to learn it, and came out sideways, the way such things do. It was the 5th Sunday, late November, with the first snow of the season still on the peaks and threatening to come lower. She had asked him, without entirely planning to, why he'd come to Colorado territory. He'd said what he'd said, the light, the land, plans for spring. And then, after a pause that had a particular shape to it, he'd said, I needed to be somewhere that didn't know me from before. She understood that completely. Before what? She asked anyway. Before I was the man whose wife died, he said. Margaret, 6 years ago. Fever. He said it the way a person said a thing they'd said many times and had found the exact plain shape of. I spent 2 years being that man, in a town that remembered her and treated me like I was still half the loss of her. Couldn't figure out how to be just myself in a place that kept adding her ghost to the room. Clara looked at the table. People here add Daniel, she said, not unkindly. They mean well, but sometimes I can feel them doing it. 14 months, he said. Not a question. She'd mentioned it once in passing, and he'd remembered. 14 months, she agreed. I won't add him, Caleb said. He's yours to carry. None of my business. She looked up at him. It was possibly the most useful thing anyone had said to her since the funeral. They sat with the snow coming down outside the window, and the stove doing its work and the biscuits going cold between them. And Clara thought that there was a particular kind of loneliness that was not about being alone, but about being known only in relation to someone you'd lost. Being seen as a chapter in someone else's story, instead of the main text of your own. He saw her as the main text. She couldn't have said exactly how she knew that. She knew it the way you know certain things about the mountains, not from being told, but from watching them long enough. December came hard and early that year. The snow that had been threatening off the peaks came down in full force on the first Friday of the month and stayed. The road between her property and the Dunmore lease became the kind of road that required intention to travel. Caleb Marsh traveled it anyway. He arrived the following Sunday with his coat carrying an inch of snow and a burlap sack that turned out to contain potatoes, dried beans, and a small jar of winter preserves from some earlier season. I didn't know if the road was going to be worse, he said. It's manageable, Clara said. Endured, he corrected, and she felt something in her chest shift the way it did sometimes, when she wasn't expecting it. She made coffee. He brought in wood without being asked, which she noticed and didn't comment on. He had a practical understanding of what needed doing in a house that seemed to come from somewhere deep in him. Not performance, not the busy helpfulness of a man trying to prove a point, but the quiet, automatic attentiveness of someone who simply saw what needed seeing and did it. That was the thing about Caleb Marsh. She had decided by December. He paid attention, not to what was convenient or what reflected well on him, to what was actually there. The leaning fence post. He'd mentioned it once, and she'd said it was fine, and he'd said nothing further, but the following week it was upright. The window latch on the south side of the kitchen that caught when the temperature dropped. She'd wrestled it closed one Sunday while he was there, and he'd watched and said nothing, but the next week, there was oil on the hinge, and the latch moved clean. She had not thanked him for either of these things. She wasn't sure whether this was stubbornness or a kind of understanding between them that had developed without discussion. He didn't seem to want thanking. He seemed to want, as far as she could tell, nothing from her except what she'd already given. a table on Sunday, and the truth of what she actually thought about things when he asked her. He asked her what she thought about things regularly. Not in the manner of a man conducting an interview. In the manner of a man who was genuinely curious about the answer. She had told him what she thought about the proposed new mill on the south end of town, about the difficulty of keeping a kitchen garden in this elevation, about the question of whether Berta Scholl should consider moving closer to her daughter in Pueblo before another winter made the decision for her. He had listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention that doesn't just wait for its turn to speak. It was the second Sunday in January, with the mountains buried white to their tree lines and the road requiring the intention of a man who genuinely planned to be somewhere, that he arrived later than usual and sat down at the table without his ordinary ease. She noticed immediately the quality of his stillness was different. He held his coffee cup without drinking from it, which was unlike him. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He looked up. Nothing happened. Something did. He set the cup down. "I had a conversation in town yesterday, at the feed store." Haskell Brome, he said. The name was enough. Haskell Brome ran the feed store, was on the town council, and had a particular opinion about widows and propriety that he aired without encouragement. "What did he say?" Clara said. Caleb looked at her steadily. "He said I ought to be careful about the impression I was giving. Coming around regular to a widow's place. Said it was putting ideas in people's heads." "What kind of ideas?" Clara said, though she knew perfectly well. "The matrimonial kind," Caleb said. "He said it wasn't fair to you, coming around like I had intentions when I hadn't said I did. Said a woman in your position couldn't afford to have people talking." Clara picked up her own cup. "Set it down." "What did you say?" "I said it wasn't his concern what I intended." "And what do you intend?" she said. The question came out the way some questions did. Not planned, but necessary. She had been waiting, she realized, to ask it. Not for an answer that obligated her to anything. For an answer that told her who she was dealing with. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Snow moved against the window. "I intend to keep coming on Sundays," he said, "for as long as you'll have me at your table. And I intend to tell you plainly, since apparently plainness is required, that I've been coming because I'd rather spend Sunday at your table than any other place I can think of. And I don't know what that means for you, and I'm not asking you to decide it today." He picked up the cup. "But I didn't want you hearing Haskell Brome's version of my intentions before you'd heard mine." She looked at him. The gray light of January came through the window and lay across the table between them, and the biscuits were cooling on the rack behind her, and outside the snow made the whole world into a particular kind of quiet. "Haskell Brome," she said, "has been telling me what other people's intentions are since Daniel died, and he has been wrong every time." Caleb's mouth moved into what she had come to recognize as the expression he wore when he was more relieved than he was going to admit. "What I intend," Clara said, "is to keep making biscuits on Sundays. And I'd rather you were here to eat some of them than not. That's what I intend. If that's enough to start with." "That's more than enough," he said. February was brutal in the way of Colorado Februaries. The kind of cold that made every task outside into an act of deliberate will and every moment inside into something to be grateful for. Caleb's lease road drifted badly in the second week, and he arrived one Sunday on foot, having left the horse at the livery in town and walked the rest of the way, which was 2 miles, in the kind of wind that had genuine opinions about being outdoors. He appeared at her door red-faced and entirely unruffled about the state of himself, knocking snow off his coat on the porch in the same unhurried manner he brought to most things. "You walked," she said. "Road was drifted," he said. "You could have stayed in town." He looked at her with a mild steadiness. "I could have," he said, and left it there. She pulled the door wider and took his coat when he shrugged out of it and hung it near the stove to dry, and made coffee that he held in both hands like it was the most important thing he'd encountered all week. They sat at the table and she told him about the kale that was somehow still alive under the snow in the far corner of the garden, stubbornly green and improbable, and he said it reminded him of something, and when she asked what he said, "You," which was the most direct thing he'd ever said to her, she looked at the table. "I'm not stubborn," she said. "You made it through 14 months alone on this property in Colorado winter," he said, "and you're still cooking 24 biscuits on Sundays, and you keep a kitchen garden that the frost can't fully kill." He set down the coffee. "That's not stubbornness, Mrs. Holt. That's just your character." "Clara," she said. It came out without planning. He looked at her. "You've been calling me Mrs. Holt for 4 months," she said. "My name is Clara." "Clara," he said, and the way he said it was so plain and careful that it felt like something being set down gently rather than picked up, which was exactly how she wanted it. She did not cry. She had cried enough in 14 months, and she was not, at this particular moment, sad. She was something closer to the opposite of sad, and it felt tentative and real and worth being careful with. March thawed the road enough that driving was possible again. She went with him one Sunday to look at the east fence line he'd been working on, because he'd mentioned the lumber issue a second time, and she'd said she knew something about fence lines from the years Daniel had taught her to spot a bad post from a good one. They walked the line in the mud and early cold, and she showed him the posts that would go before spring was out, and 2 others that were borderline. And he listened without the look some men got when a woman told them something practical, that particular slight tension of a man recalibrating downward. He just looked at the posts and looked at her and said, "How can you tell from here?" She showed him. He paid attention. He fixed the posts the following week. April came with wildflowers along the road that had not been there in March, and one Sunday morning Clara looked out at the kitchen garden and saw that the kale, which had endured all winter and into spring, had finally given itself over entirely to something new, gone to seed at its edges, making room for what came next. She thought about that longer than she probably needed to. She was at the stove when she heard his horse on the road, and then at the gate, and then his knock at the open door, and she thought, 1 year ago, I was setting 1 cup out, and catching myself with the coffee already poured. 1 year ago, I was making 2 dozen biscuits out of habit with no one to help me understand why I was still doing it. "Clara," he said from the doorway. "I'm here," she said. He came in and took his hat off and set it on the chair he'd come to think of as his. She had come to think of it that way too, without discussion, and she turned from the stove and looked at him in the particular morning light that came through the east window in April, and said what she'd been working toward for some weeks, without quite naming it. "I want to ask you something." "All right," he said. "Are you planning to stay?" "Not this Sunday. In general." He looked at her with the full, unhurried attention he brought to things that mattered. "Yes," he said. "On the lease," she said, "or somewhere more permanent." He understood what she was asking. She could see that he understood. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what's available." She looked at the table. 2 cups. She had started setting 2 cups without catching herself sometime in November, and she had never mentioned it, and neither had he. "I have 40 acres, she said. "Good water. The south field needs work, but it's good land underneath. Berta Scholl says you have the best cattle instinct she's seen since her late husband, and she's told half the town, so that's already done without you asking." She looked up at him. "I'm not offering out of necessity. I want to be clear about that. I managed 14 months without anyone's help, and I could manage 14 more." "I know," he said. He said it the way he said most things, like he meant it completely. "I'm offering because on Sundays, when you don't come, I cook 2 dozen biscuits anyway, and then I understand exactly why, and it seems like the practical answer is to stop pretending that's going to change." His expression did the quiet thing it did when he was moved by something and not going to make a display of it. He pulled his chair from the table and sat down and laced his hands together and looked at her for a long moment. "My intentions," he said, "which I told you about in January, they haven't changed." "Neither have mine," she said. "Then I'll put the question directly," he said, "since you asked me for directness." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me, Clara Holt? Not because either of us is without options. Because I want to spend Sundays at your table for the rest of my life, and I'd rather do that honestly than keep pretending I'm here for the biscuits." She looked at him. Outside the window, the April mountains were coming into their best color, the snow retreating up the peaks and the green moving in behind it the way it did each year without fail, as if loss and return were simply the rhythm of things and neither one was the whole story. "You're here for the biscuits," she said. "Partly," he allowed. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Caleb Marsh." He exhaled with a slowness that told her what the question had cost him to ask. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. She turned back to the stove. He got up and got his own cup and poured his own coffee and sat back down, and they ate breakfast in the Sunday morning light, with the mountains going gold outside the window. 2 people who had each learned the particular weight of absence and had each, in their own stubborn way, kept setting the table anyway. That autumn, After the wedding that the town attended in full, and that the Reverend's wife declared a proper ending to a difficult chapter, without quite understanding that it was not an ending at all, Caleb folded his lease into Clara's 40 acres and began the work of the east field she'd said needed work underneath. He was right that it was good land. She was right that it needed work. They argued about the fence line placement civilly, and she won, which he allowed with the grace of a man who had already suspected she'd be right. Berta Scholl came to Sunday dinner once a month. Caleb always brought extra wood before she arrived. The biscuits, Clara made 24 of every week. There were more people to eat them now. That was the only thing that had changed, and it was enough. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who feel it, and the ones who share it. If this one stayed with you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another story about two people on the frontier who found each other when they'd stopped expecting to. And we tell those stories here, at the Hidden Acre.